a gente vai ainda aguardar...
Meu Deus do céu, cara.
Oi? Vinícius?
Desculpe. Não, aqui foi mal, o café não sai aqui. Eu só não tinha tirado o áudio. Desculpe.
Ah, tá bom. Imagina. Como eu dizia, a gente ainda vai aguardar, né? Agora são 3 minutos passados do nosso horário, então vamos aguardar ainda mais alguns minutos para que as pessoas terminem de chegar e daqui a pouco, tão logo, a gente dá início. Então, eu peço só paciência de mais alguns minutinhos, que daqui a pouco a gente começa. Mas, de todo modo, já de antemão, né, agradecendo imensamente a presença do nosso convidado, professor Illetterati. Então, Michela, por favor, não sei se o professor acompanhou e compreende o meu português, mas, se não, Michela transmite aí os nossos agradecimentos iniciais e a satisfação que gozamos de contar com a sua presenza.
Luca, è tutto chiaro?
No, insomma, pare di sì.
Ringraziamo tanto.
Se dobbiamo aspettare, quello non ho capito.
Vorrebbero aspettare solo qualche minuto, perché di solito ci mettono un po' ad arrivare. 5-6 minuti.
5 minuti.
Ok.
Perfetto.
Aspetta che chiudo il telefono, sennò... Questo è già il 7º incontro, visto?
Sì, fra poco arriva l'ultimo, conclusivo, dove parleranno, se non mi ricordo male, a Riccardo Terra della USP, Maria Lucia Cacciola della USP e Vinicius, che conosci bene. Adesso, visto che è arrivato anche il presidente della Sociedade Hegel, Riccardo Tassinari.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
We already meet in the Congress in
Sao Leopoldo?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah. Thanks a lot for being here.
My pleasure.
Bem-vindo, Ricardo. A Michela me disse que convidou você para participar também do nosso encontro lá no Happy Hour sobre Hegel. Vocês vão falar sobre Hegel hoje.
A gente vai conversar um pouquinho, mas vamos falar alguma coisa sobre Hegel hoje.
Obrigado por aceitar o convite.
Luca, ti spiego di questa iniziativa che è molto bella, che sta facendo Fernando. Desde quando você abriu o boteco, Fernando?
Começou em abril, Michela.
Isso. Da aprile, tutti i mercoledì sera, c'è questo bar filosofico online con un invitato che fa una specie di conferenza e poi c'è un dibattito e la cosa è eccezionale, perché praticamente il bar apre alle 6:30 di sera, gli ultimi se ne vanno di solito verso l'1 alle 2 di mattina.
Ed è permesso l'uso di alcol? È consentito?
Sì.
È obbligatorio.
Okay.
È un bar.
Obbligatorio.
Allora forse partecipo.
Sì. Michela sempre fica até o final, até as 2 da manhã.
Eu tomei a sério a quarentena, gente.
Fernando, eu é que agradeço o convite e parabéns pela iniciativa, viu? Muito legal. Fico muito feliz de participar.
Ricardo. Apareça sempre. A Michela te passa as informações. Essa
Amanhã
quarta
vai
vamos ter a Nádia, que é da Unicamp, vai falar sobre Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt e a questão judaica. Vinícius está onde? Está num lugar bonito aí, Vinícius?
Eu estou tomando um café na volta da minha análise e não ia dar tempo de chegar para ver o Luca no começo, então eu pretendo tomar esse café. Quando ele começar a falar, vou desligar a câmera e vou para casa e espero acabar de ver lá.
Legal,
Então estou num café aqui, dando um intervalo para ver vocês. Obrigado. Obrigado. O lugar é esse, Fernando.
Esse que é no centro ali, no centro de Curitiba?
Não, esse é outro. Esse é no Batel.
Tá, que eu lembro que tinha um café legal, que na Ampof a gente ia muito. Depois eu voltei a ele algumas vezes. Bem ali na Praça Central, né?
Sim, aquele é legal também. Mas não é esse, não.
Tá.
Vinícius, sei a Curitiba, tu?
Sì, sono a Curitiba.
Ok.
Abito qui da tanto, insomma.
Sì, mi ricordo che abitavi lì.
Sì.
Come so che cambi spesso su tante cose, ho pensato che eri cambiato anche casa.
E la tua figliola va bene?
Bene, molto bene. Sì.
E adesso cominci a studiare all'università?
Sì, sta facendo sociologia.
Anche il mio figlio, anche Francesco, insomma. Brava. E fai proprio a Padova?
Sì. Avevi iniziato a Trento e poi è tornata a Padova.
Capito. Certo.
Vinicius, complimenti per l'italiano.
No, io ho perso un po' tutto, insomma. Devo rimanere un po' in Italia per ricominciare a parlare, così è un po' difficile.
Vieni.
Sì, vado. Presto.
Visto che c'è anche Marloren.
C'è?
Morgan.
Oi, Luca. Va bene? Tutto bene qui.
Sempre allo stadio a vedere calcio?
Marloren perguntou se você está na arena para assistir jogo de futebol. Acho que não dá agora, né?
Não, infelizmente estamos sem futebol aqui. Mas, quer dizer, o futebol continua, né? A gente aqui não pode entrar no estádio.
Marloren é do Sul?
Sim. Na URG, estava na UFG ano passado. Sigo aí trabalhando com a Michela, né? Há algum tempo já.
Você que levou ela para o mau caminho gremista?
Sim, claro.
Não é possível.
Grande Maria Lúcia.
Oi, tudo bom?
Tudo bom?
Oi, Malu.
Tudo, beleza, oi.
Oi, Maria Lúcia.
Queria só falar uma coisa.
Eu só estou vendo a Michela e o Fernando. Por quê? Alguma coisa aconteceu.
É porque ela já compartilhou a tela, daí fica...
Oi, gente. Eu estou com dificuldade na minha conexão. Eu caí, mas agora voltou. Vocês estão me ouvindo?
Sim, senhor.
Muito bem. Estamos ouvindo, perfeitamente.
Oh, Maria Lúcia.
Oi, hello, Bruno.
Bom, já são, então... Eu vou pedir para o... Então, se vocês me permitem, gostaria de dar início à nossa conferência do dia de hoje. só antes, perguntando, Pedro, já estamos no ar no YouTube? Já podemos, então, começar? Sim? Ok. So, today, I would like to first of all, thanks our conferencist, our professor, our invited professor from the day, the professor Luca Illetterati, from the Department of Philosophy, Sociology, Education and Applied Psychology de la Universidade de Pádua, who is invited today to offer us a conference about Hegel's and Schelling's readings of Kant's Critique of Teleological Judgement. So, first of all, thank you, Professor Luca. It's an honor for us to have you in this Ringvorlesung, and we are very honored to have your presence here. And I would say that the title of your conference could not be better than which is, because we that are discussing Kant's critique of judgment and its readings, such as Fichte's, Schelling's. So that's all about we have been discussing since the last seven encounters. So I will begin to talk in Portuguese for a little, and then I will we'll call Professor Luca. So, Professor Luca é professor de Filosofia Teorética na Universidade de Pádua, onde coordena o grupo de pesquisa em Filosofia Clássica Alemã. Ele é também professor presidente da Sociedade Italiana de Filosofia Teorética. A pesquisa de Luca se desenvolve em várias áreas. Um de seus interesses principais é a filosofia da biologia e, mais especificamente, questões vinculadas à teleologia, à filosofia da vida e do organismo. A sua pesquisa também cruza questões de lógica e metafísica, com especial atenção, né, aos estudos kantianos e hegelianos. No entanto, seus interesses não se esgotam aí, né? A Luca tem uma série de publicações relevantes, dentre as quais eu destaco, não é, as mais recentes: Purposiveness, Teleology Between Nature and Mind, que é de 2008, Natura e Ragione sullo sviluppo della idea di natura em Hegel, que é um dos primeiros trabalhos, de 95. Né? Então, o professor Luca, como se pode ver pelo título, e como eu já disse, vai, né, como continuar as nossas discussões que vieram sendo travadas até agora, né? No último encontro, nós tivemos a oportunidade, precisamente, de discutir a leitura de Schelling, né? Ou a presença da terceira crítica de Kant na filosofia de Schelling, e agora a gente continua como este mesmo tema, né? Discutindo, né, as leituras de Schelling e Hegel, né, as leituras que ambos fizeram da crítica do juízo teleológico, ou da faculdade de julgar teleológica. Então, eu passo a palavra ao professor Luca. Muito obrigado.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be here with you. I have a special connection with Brazil, and it is always a pleasure for me to have the possibility to speak with the Brazilian friends. I would like to thank Professor Nadai and I don't remember the name, Pedro Farat, for the organization and for the invitation. I start with my talk, with my presentation. In this talk, I will focus on Hegelian and on the Schellingian readings of Kant critiques of the power of judgment. In particular, I will focus on the second part of the critique of the power of judgment, that is the part dedicated to the teleological judgment, and so to the question around what we call natural purposiveness. In this part of the third critique, Kant addresses our understanding of organic nature by means of a teleological perspective that overcomes the boundaries of the period's prevailing mechanistic explanatory framework. Schelling and Hegel, as well as Goethe, consider the critique of power of judgment the very climax of Kantian philosophy. In this sense, we can assume as emblematic what Hegel claims in Faith and Knowledge, that is one of the critical writings of the first years of the 19th century, when the collaboration between Hegel and Schelling is particularly narrow and the communion of their ideas is particularly strong. According to Hegel, the critique of power of judgment, the critique of power of judgment was the most interesting point in the Kantian system. This is a quotation from Faith and Knowledge. The point at which a region is recognized that is a middle between the empirical manifold and the absolute abstract unity. It is namely in the reflecting judgment that Kant finds the middle term between the concept of nature and the concept of freedom. On one side, there is the objective manifold determined by concepts, the intellect generally, and on the other side, the intellect as pure abstraction. Neither theoretical nor practical philosophy had lifted themselves above the sphere of the absolute judgment. The middle ground is the region of the identity of what in the absolute judgment is subject and predicate. This identity is the one and only true reason. This is Hegel. If the critique of power of judgment is the most interesting point in the Kantian system, at the same time, Hegel and Schelling believe that in this very climax of the Kantian philosophy emerges the structural limits of the Kantian approach, that is, in Schellingian and Hegelian terms, a reflective approach. What I want to emphasize in this talk are precisely the reasons that drive Hegel and Schelling to a radical criticism of what they think as the very climax of Kant's speculative philosophy. These reasons have not simply to do with a different interpretation of the realm of nature and of living nature in particular. These reasons have to do with the necessity, according to Schelling and Hegel, to rethink the relation between epistemology and ontology in Kantian thought. And so, with reasons that it is possible to call metaphysical reasons. So, The aim of my presentation is not to determine whether or not the Hegelian and Schellingian readings of the critic power of judgment are correct, but why they read it in the way they do. Why they read it in the way they do. The talk is divided into 3 parts. In the first part, I present a brief reconstruction of Kantian argument about the possibility to use the teleological judgment with reference to nature. In the second part, I will show why Hegel and Schelling are unsatisfied of Kantian argument. Finally, in the conclusion, I try to demonstrate that this Schellingian and Hegelian unsatisfaction with regard to the Kantian theory of teleological judgment must be placed into a new framework of rationality, which implies a very different approach with regard to the connection between epistemology and ontology. So, first part, the problem of natural purposiveness in Kant's critique of the power of judgment. Is it okay with the audio? Is it okay? The question of natural purposiveness in Kant famously implies an antinomy. On the one hand, according to Kant, teleological concepts are necessary in order to understand some kinds of natural objects, namely organized objects. On the other hand, teleology is problematic insofar as it takes our comprehension of organized beings beyond the scope of scientific discourse. On the one hand, according to Kant, the teleological concepts are necessary in order to understand some kinds of natural objects, namely natural organized beings and also living beings. On the other hand, this very approach is problematic insofar as it takes the possibility of a comprehension of natural organized beings beyond limits of science. We can try to further explicate the terms of the antinomia. For Kant, the only model of causality who is admitted into the scientific explanation of the natural world is the efficient causality, or that causality which is coherent with a mechanistic view of the world. Organized beings, organisms, which are obviously natural beings, are, however, always according to Kant, inexplicable with this kind of causality. The mechanistic framework is incapable to grasp the very structure of an organized being. In particular, the mechanistic framework and the model of causality, which is coherent with it, is incapable to think these 3 points. The mutual relations between parts and whole, which are typical of the organisms. The dynamic of growth of the organism, and third, the form of reproduction of the organisms. In order to comprehend this way of being, the way of being of organisms, we have to assume, even according to Kant, a teleological model of explanation, and we have to go to a model of causality, which is no more the efficient causality, but the final causality, or that kind of causality that modern science has banned from the possibility of a scientific explanation of the natural world. To assume that nature has something like a purpose, an end, or a goal seems in effect to imply that at the basis of nature, we have to put a supernatural entity, an intelligence, or a divine architect who is at the origin of all this purposiveness. However, according to Kant, this presupposition, the presupposition of a supernatural entity, is as unsustainable for an explanation of nature which intends to be a scientific explanation. In this way, comprehension of organized beings that implies the reference to a teleological framework of explanation produces an antinomy. It is necessary, but we can't have a teleological explanation of organized being as natural beings. Kant's theory of teleological judgment with respect to natural organisms can be considered as a strategy to justify the use of teleological notions in scientific explanation of natural objects, and in particular of biological ones. According to Kant, the impossibility of presupposing an intelligence as the origin of ends in nature does not prevent us from using a teleological approach with respect to living beings. Kant himself maintained that when we adopt the teleological approach, we have to be aware that the claim of final causality in nature is legitimate only by means of analogy. According to Kant, in fact, the analogy with the sphere of human intentional action is the only coherent way we can think of such causality. Yet, within the sphere of human action and the arts, this kind of causality is not problematic, because in this case, ends always presuppose a will, an intention as their origin. Nevertheless, says Kant, teleological judging is rightly drawn into our research into nature, at least problematically, but only in order to bring it under principle of observation and research in analogy, I underline, in analogy with causality according to ends, without presuming thereby to explain it, without presuming to explain it. This analogical use suggests that teleological judgment is only reflective and cannot shed light on the ontological status of organized beings, of nature, of living beings. This is why the notion of purposiveness, according to Kant, belongs, I quote, belongs to the reflecting, not to the determining power of judgment. Therefore, it is a concept employed for guiding research into object of this kind, end of quotation. In this sense, we can say that the teleological judgment has a general epistemological value in order to guide the research into the organic world, but has no ontological commitment. It does not make possible to say that organized beings are effectively teleological organized, or that organized beings are as we know them. Kant's analogical strategy, which borrows from the technical practical sphere in order to understand the natural one, is not the only move that Kant makes in order to legitimize the teleological approach with respect to nature. Kant also distinguishes between two different models of purposiveness, external and internal purposiveness. Only the second one has an epistemic value with respect to our knowledge of the natural world. Which are the main features of these two models of purposiveness? External purposiveness takes place when an entity or a natural event appears to be oriented towards something else, utility. By external purposiveness, I mean that in which one thing in nature serves another as the means to an end. Purposiveness in this case is contingent in the thing itself to which it is ascribed. Internal or inner purposiveness takes place when a single thing is simultaneously a cause and effect of itself. That is, when the end of an object is the realization of the object itself. This distinction is essential for Kant. On the basis of this distinction, he can rehabilitate the notion of purposiveness and save it from the criticism of teleology which characterized the birth of modern science. For Kant, external purposiveness is also the model of purposiveness at the basis of artifacts, because it depends on an entity different from the artifact itself. An object can be an end for something else only if its purposiveness finds its origin in another item external to it that plays a causal role with respect to the object itself. In this sense, external purposiveness implies the presupposition of an intelligence that serves as the origin and justification of purposes. It is for this reason, according to Kant, we cannot apply the notion of external purposiveness in order to explicate the way of being of natural objects. In order to say that something exists as a natural end, we have to recognize it as characterized by an internal purposiveness. More specifically, in order to say that something exists as a natural end, it is required that its parts be combined into a whole by being reciprocally the cause and effect of their form. The products of nature which satisfies these conditions and which thus can be considered as natural ends are natural organized beings, and in particular living beings. According to Kant, a living being can be both a cause and effect of itself in at least three senses. Firstly, with respect to the species, in the sense that an organism, by producing another, continuously preserves itself as species, is therefore both a cause and an effect of the survival of the species. Secondly, with respect to the individual, in the sense of growth, which is to be taken, growth, in such a way that it is entirely distinct from any other increase in magnitude in accordance with mechanical law. Instead, it is a form of generative production or generation, Zeugung is the German word, necessary to the development of all organisms, being thus the cause of itself, by means of material which, as far as its composition is concerned, is its own product, and therefore an effect of itself. Thirdly, in the sense that the preservation of each part is, I quote, reciprocally dependent on the preservation of the others. E.g., leaves are certainly products of the tree, therefore its effects, yet they preserve it in turn and are therefore causes. Since internal purposiveness is not reducible to external purposiveness, and since this implies that there is a kind of purposiveness which cannot be reduced to an intention, the application of a teleological model to the natural world is possible only in relation with the first one. The application of the external purposiveness model to natural beings implies unsustainable assumptions. In this sense, the distinction between internal and external purposiveness seems to satisfy surely an epistemological demand, but perhaps an ontological demand too. for the epistemological demand. The difference between internal and external purposiveness shows the futility of scientific accounts of nature using teleological principles based upon external purposiveness, as in the various forms of anthropocentric and cosmic teleology, as in the classification of Ernst Mayr, and the possibility of teleology based on intrinsic purposiveness in the consideration of organized products of nature, albeit mainly with a regulative and heuristic function. The distinction between internal and external purposiveness also seems to highlight a difference that is an ontological difference between natural and technical products. I quote, "An organized being is thus not a mere machine, because that as a solely moving force, bewegende Kraft. Rather, it possesses formative force, and indeed of a kind which it communicates to kinds of matter, materien, which do not have it. It organizes them. Thus, a self-propagating formative force, which cannot be explained through the capacity for movement, mechanism alone." In other words, Kant argues on the one hand that mechanism, as a reference to efficient causes, cannot account for the structure of organized beings, which seems to invoke a form of technical causation. Technik der Natur, says Kant, a technical causation. However, a technical account is also inadequate to explain organized beings for two reasons. First, because the reference to intelligent design lies beyond the scope of proper natural science, and second, because organized beings display a peculiar form of self-organization that sets them apart from machines. Kant's solution to this predicament is to argue that the purposive features displayed by organized beings should not be considered ontologically defining properties. Ideas as having their own constitutive character, but should rather be ascribed to the way we make sense of them based on our own particular cognitive faculties. Ideas as reflective of the regulative principle of our power of judgment. But if this is so, we cannot, as Kant does, make a real ontological distinction between the organism and the machine, because the internal purposiveness cannot, in fact, have a real ontological function within Kant's horizon of thought, but only an epistemological one. This is exactly the point that makes a problem for Hegel and Schelling. It is to this connection between epistemology and the ontological commitment of internal purposiveness that Schelling and Hegel, as the index of, that is for Schelling and Hegel, the index of a radical incoherence in Kant's argument. Which are the terms of this incoherence? On the one hand, Kant shows that the self-producing structure of living beings is irreducible to any kind of causality known to us. Living beings are not entities which are explicable through the efficient causality that is at work in physics. At the same time, organisms are not simply artifacts. if they were artifacts, we might be able to explain them through the same model of explanation that we use for artifacts, that is the model of external purposiveness. In this sense, an organism could be considered an organized structure, and the principle of organization could be the author at the origin of it. This framework of explanation leads these particular natural entities out of nature, because we would have the necessity to admit something external to nature in order to consider them. This irreducibility of living structures to other kinds of causality seems to suggest that the notion of internal purposiveness to be the one that is able to grasp the ontological structure of the natural organized being. But on the other hand, even according to Kant, it is impossible to think of purposiveness without at the same time thinking of an intention as its justification. So if we assume that internal purposiveness is the ontological structure of living beings, we also assume the notion of an intention or of a designer at the origin of nature. This forces Kant to assume the notion of natural purposiveness as merely regulative, never constitutive. In order to think some products of nature as teleological organized, he has in fact to assume, even if only as a model, an artifact model of nature. And what does this assumption imply? Therefore, either we think that assuming the hermeneutics of artifacts as the paradigmatic way to understand nature somehow reflects the way of being of nature itself, or if we want to avoid reaching such a conclusion, we have to admit that the results conveyed by the assumption of such a model are nothing but mere subjective constructions, because we cannot attribute the purposive character to the reality we are investigating. On the one hand, the analogical strategy is invoked to justify the reference to teleological judgment in our comprehension of the natural world. On the other hand, this strategy seems to be inadequate if it is meant to grasp the way of being of living organisms, and in particular, their self-organizing principle. According to Schelling and Hegel, Kantian difficulties with the comprehension of living beings and with the notion of internal purposiveness mirror a peculiar set of dualisms which underwriting Kantian philosophy between subject and object, thinking and reality, concept and word. These dualisms can be described as the tension produced when an object of thought is something extraneous to the thinking subject. This dualism, according to Hegel and Schelling, is the characteristic of modern thought, or better to say, of that philosophy of reflection which is at work in modern thought. Philosophy of reflection, which is clearly active, according to Hegel and Schelling, in Kantian philosophy, even if Kant's thought contains the impulse to overcome it. So writes Schelling in the introduction to the Ideen für eine Philosophie der Natur. Mere reflection, therefore, is a spiritual sickness in mankind. The more so where it imposes itself in domination over the whole man and kills at the root what in germ is Eiges being, his spiritual life, which issues only from identity. It is an evil which accompanies man into life itself and distorts all his intuition, even for the more familiar objects of consideration. But its preoccupation with dissection does not extend only to the phenomenal world. So far as it separates the spiritual principle from these, it fills the intellectual world with chimeras against which, because they lie beyond all reason, it is not even possible to fight. It makes that separation between man and the world permanent, because it treats the latter as a thing in itself, which neither intuition nor imagination, neither understanding nor reason can reach. What is called into question here is the relation between thought and reality. This issue touches problematically the entirety of the modern thought, which can be seen as a way to explain the different ways thought can relate to the external reality of the subject. In other words, as an attempt to justify the epistemological possibilities of the subject in relation to the different levels and structure of reality. According to Schelling and Hegel, the Kantian distinction between a phenomenal world, which is organized through the categories of the understanding, and a nomanic world, which is necessarily and structurally unreachable by knowledge, makes reality, according to Hegel and Schelling, something which can be comprehensible only through a sort of subjectivation or a sort of reduction of the objectivity to the subjectivity. Beyond this subjective reality, there can be only a chaotic world who has no reason, no structure, no logos, and which cannot be called a word in the real sense. If subject and word, thinking and reality are conceived of as separate, their relation can be understood in two classical ways. Either the mind is a sort of tabula rasa to which reality imparts its content, or reality is formed by rules that the subject imparts to it. These two positions can be called in different ways that turns across, I think, today's discussion too: idealism and realism, transcendentalism and empiricism, constructivism and objectivism. Schelling and Hegel seem to think that all these positions are one-sided, and because of these, they continuously replicate the separation between subject and word instead of escaping it. According to Hegel and Schelling, in terms of overcoming the problems implicit in a transcendental position in every form of subjectivist foundation of the objectivity, and at least in every constructivist position, the realist philosopher, who moves from the assumption of a reality that is partly or fully independent from thought, seems to have the upper hand. Realists argue that the world is not the product of mental construction. But if reality is completely independent from thought, a series of questions arises, according to Hegel and Schelling. How does one access reality? If reality is completely other with respect to the thinking subject, our discourses about reality end up being a mere interpretation of it. Does the realist who wants to show reality's independence from thought risk legitimating the very attitude from which he or she is running by saying no facts, but only interpretations. Further, still, does a strong ontological realist position that sets reality as independent from thought not risk to find itself supporting a very weak epistemological position that makes knowledge and all of our other discourses on the word an artifice of the subject without any relation to what is ontologically recognized as other from it? These are the questions that Schelling and Hegel are discussing in contrast with Kant on the one side, the side of the transcendental perspective, and Jacobi to the other side, the side of the realist perspective. According to Schelling and Hegel, the escape from the problems that pass through modern thought is to overcome the gap between thought and reality, between subject and object, and thus to rethink the supposed separation between epistemology and ontology. By placing the I and the word, thought and being, within dynamic relationships that prevent the sedimentation of the subject on the one hand and of the object on the other, in autonomous and independent structures, the resulting metaphysics intends, on the one hand, to place itself beyond the abstract distinction between materialism and immaterialism, between realism and idealism, between ontology and epistemology, and to recognize the possibility of a discourse concerning reality that is neither reduced to the hypothesis of a subject that simply passively reflects the word in itself, nor of a subject that, through its noetic prosthesis, implements a conceptual structure to reality that would otherwise be deprived of it. This is the concern underlying of Hegel and Schelling criticism of the Kantian theory of teleological judgment as a reflective judgment. The assumption of the inner purposiveness of nature as a reflective judgment that has only a regulative value for guiding the research into the object, into the word of living being, and that can say no words about the real being of the object and of the word of living being, is evidently, according to Kant and Schelling, the product of the subjective presupposition of a division between thinking and the reality, between spirit and nature, between mind and word. I quote Schelling from always from the ideas for a philosophy of nature. For as soon as we enter the realm of organic nature, so writes Schelling, repeating apparently Kant's words, all mechanical linkage of cause and effect ceases for us. Only between quite different things is a relation of cause and effect possible. The organic, however, produces itself, arises out of itself. Every organic product carries the reason of its existence in itself, for it is cause and effect of itself. And only in organized beings are they, the ends, real. Real is the word of Schelling. They exist without my participation. Without my participation. Internal purposiveness for Schelling is not a product of the subjective thinking who is considering an object that is not, in its concrete reality, purposively organized. According to Schelling, internal purposiveness is not a conceptual scheme that the subject imposes on the world in order to make it intelligible for a mind which is extraneous to it. I quote, "Thus, a concept lies at the base of every organization, for where there is a necessary relation of the whole to the part and of the part to the whole, there is concept." To say that the organism is concept is to say that the concept is not, as typical of the mere reflective standpoint, something that belongs only and exclusively to the subject. This concept, says Schelling, dwells in the organization itself and can by no means be separated from it. This acknowledgement of the reality of the concept of the organism is not a return to the type of theistic metaphysics that Kant criticizes when he deconstructs the physico-teleological view of the world, a view based on the assumption that external purposiveness is the organizing principle of the world. Rather, it is an acknowledgement of the intrinsic self-organizing, self-poetic features of organic nature. Similarly, and perhaps more radically, Hegel claims that considering internal purposiveness of natural organized beings as a production of a subjective or a reflective thought about the natural object is a form of reducing internal purposiveness to an external purposiveness. External purposiveness is, as we have seen, the purposiveness that takes place when an entity or a natural event appears to be oriented towards something else utility. In Faith and Knowledge, the text in which the young Hegel discusses the philosophy of Kant, Jacobi, Fichte as different forms of a single approach that he, together with Schelling, calls Reflexionsphilosophien, Hegel summarizes the Kantian position on the possibility of comprehension of the purposiveness of nature as still abiding by a somewhat technical understanding of purposiveness. I quote, "Kant recognizes that in and for itself, it may be possible that the mechanism of nature, the causal relation, and its teleological technicism are one. Although Kant recognizes these as not impossible and as one form of thinking, he still remains with the way of thinking on which nature is simply divided, and what knows it is a correspondingly contingent, simply finite, and subjective cognitive faculty, which he calls the human cognitive faculty, and declares the rational cognition for which organism, as truly real reason, is the higher principle of nature and the identity of the universal and the particular to be transcendent. If the concept of inner purposiveness that constitutes the concept of the organisms itself is transcendent, every purposiveness becomes, according to Hegel, necessary an external purposiveness. Into the systematic elaboration of the logic, the Hegelian position with regard to the question of teleology and purposiveness is even more clear. In paragraph 204 of the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, into the section explicitly named by Hegel teleology, he writes, "Purpose is the concept that is for itself and that has entered into a free, concrete existence. Purpose is therefore the concept that has entered into existence, that is no more only a concept of a subject. Purpose is a concept that has reached its concrete existence. Purpose is therefore the concept that has entered into existence that is no longer only the concept of a subject. Purpose is a concept that has reached its concrete existence. The complexity of Hegel's evaluation of Kant's notion of purposiveness is evident here. According to Hegel, Kant's focus on the concept of purpose is one of the most profound contributions made in all of critical philosophy. But at the same time, the way in which Kant comprehends the concept of purpose is radical evidence of the narrowness of Kantian philosophy. Indeed, Hegel writes in the Anmerkung to the paragraph 204, with regard to the purpose, one should not immediately or should not merely think of the form in which it is in consciousness, as a determination on end in the representation. Through the concept of inner purposiveness, Kant reawakened the idea in general and that of life in particular. Aristotle's determination of life already contains the inner purposiveness and thus stands infinitely far beyond the concept of modern teleology, which has only the finite, the external purposiveness in view. The great merit of Kant is therefore to have reawakened the idea in general and that of life in particular. In Hegel's view, Kant criticized modern metaphysics for understanding natural purposiveness in terms of mere utility and emphasized the incongruence of referring to an external producer when talking about natural objects. His distinction between internal and external purposiveness is aimed precisely at discarding this metaphysical assumption. On the other side, Kant is quite firm in maintaining that we can only conceive of natural organization according to the model of technical practical purposiveness. He therefore thinks of natural purposiveness as a regulative principle. We cannot claim that organized beings are the results of a divine design, but we do not seem to have other option for conceiving of them. Thus, we must consider organized beings as if they were the result of intention from a merely epistemological point of view. I go to my conclusions. The very discussion of purposiveness, and particularly on inner purposiveness, has to do with the possibility of reason and consequently philosophy to grasp and comprehend reality, and most of all, to grasp and comprehend life. That is, for Schelling and Hegel, and for all the post-Kantian debate, the very core of reality. The term life is polysemius, at least in the use made of it by all the authors of the post-Kantian landscape. It is possible to say that in the German word Leben, we find the convergence of all the different meanings of life that in the Greek tradition found their representations in the very different words of zoe, bios, and psyche. With the word Leben, we index life in a biological sense, as a mode of existence, and life as the principle of living. The concept of life is the key concept for all of post-Kantian philosophy. It is crucial for Fichte, above all in the revision of the Wissenschaftslehre after 1801. It is central to the work of Schelling, of Hölderlin, of Hegel, but also Jacobi, Goethe, and old natural scientists involved in the project of giving birth to the new science of biology, whose name, biology, was coined in these years, between 18 and 84. Emphasis on the concept of life plays a peculiar critical role in Kant, in Schelling, and Hegel, in establishing a critique of what we might call, with Habermas, the discourse of modernity. According to these authors, modern thought, which is grounded in the authoritative power of the thinking subject, and which is deeply marked by the fracture between subject and reality, is a thought structurally incapable of thinking the dynamics of life. This emerges in a very clamorous way in the philosophy of Kant. For Kant, life is what we cannot comprehend with our cognitive faculty. Life is for Kant a sort of mystery. This is a long quotation, but it is very, very important to me. One says far too little about nature and its capacity in organized products if one calls these an analog of art. For in that case, one conceives of the artist, rational being outside of it. This is the external purposiveness. Rather, it organizes itself, and in every species of its organized products, of course, in accordance with some example in the whole, but also with appropriate deviations which are required in circumstances for self-preservation. Perhaps one comes closer to this unscrutable property if one calls it an analog of life. But then one must either endow matter as mere matter with a property, illusoism, that contradicts its essence, or else associate with it an alien principle standing in communion with it, a soul, in which case, however, if such a product is to be a product of nature, organized matter as an instrument of that soul is already presupposed, and thus makes that product not the least more comprehensible, or else the soul is made into an artificer of this structure, and the product must be withdrawn from corporeal nature. Strictly speaking, says Kant, genau zu reden, the organization of nature is therefore not analogous with any causality that we know. This is the very problem for Hegel and Schelling. According to Hegel, to say that life is a mystery, that we cannot comprehend life, means to say that we cannot comprehend reality, and that what we comprehend of reality is only a construction of our reason, of our cognitive faculties. That means that thinking has not escaped from its subjectivist dimension. Life is, in this sense, for Hegel, the core of reality, because it is, in a certain sense, the dimension where nature and spirit are the same, where it is not possible to separate what is mere nature from what is spirit. The main idea of the post-Kantian philosophers, and of Hegel in particular, was that modern thought, dominated by the fracture between subject and object, mind and word, nature and spirit, is incapable of thinking that complex dimension of being that is life. a dimension in which the subject is also the object, and the object is also the subject. A dimension which deconstructs the strong separation between epistemology and ontology from the inside, or which deconstructs the possibility to maintain as different discourses the one that focuses on what there is and the one that focuses on our knowing about what there is. The question of life shows the artificiality of this separation. According to Hegel, life is not simply a substance indifferent to the dimension of the subject. It is neither simply the product of subjective thought. For this reason, the thought of light cannot simply be closed within ontology, leaving the subject in a way to mirror reality, or within epistemology, thus risking to reduce reality to a projection of the subject. For Hegel, the primary task of philosophy, this is a point that is very, very important for me, the primary task of philosophy is to unmask the idea defended by old metaphysics that the true is something that lies in a form of substantial objectivity, regardless of the way in which this substance itself is thought. On the other hand, just as radically, philosophy must unmask the idea that the truth is something that has nothing to do with things, which is not, cannot be objective, as it is rooted solely in the subject's conception of it. It is only within these coordinates that we can understand the radical reform to which Hegel and Schelling submit the critique of the power of judgment. In the introduction of the Erster Entwurf, Schelling maintains that if it is the task of transcendental philosophy to subordinate the real to the ideal, it is, on the other hand, the task of the philosophy of nature to explain the ideal by the real. The two sciences are therefore but one science, differentiated only in the opposite orientations of their tasks. End of quotation. In this sense, the question of the realism of purposes implies the necessity of rethinking not only the relationship between thinking and reality, between epistemology and ontology, but even more importantly, the necessity of conceiving a new concept of thinking and a new concept of reality. Although decidedly different, what characterizes both Hegelian and Schellingian philosophies is the attempt to escape both from an idealistic epistemological perspective and from a realistic ontological perspective. According to Hegel and Schelling, it is necessary to go beyond idealism, which, in order to make the world intelligible to the subject, produces an absorption of reality in the conceptual schemes of the subject, as well as realism, which, in order to avoid this subjection of the real, assumes it in its absolute independence and otherness, excluding any form of openness of the word to the subject and of the subject to the word. Both perspectives are read by Hegel and Schelling as unilateral and artificial perspectives, and both converge, though in different and perhaps even opposite ways, in the most radical subjectivism. idealist subjectivism tends to reduce reality to the forms of the subject. That is to say, to make ontology dissolve into epistemology. Realist subjectivism, on the other hand, in order to save reality from the manipulation of the subject, makes it a sort of obscure fetish that has the only function of emphasizing the limits of the conceptual schemes that the subject sets in order to try to understand it. The overcoming of idealism and realism is conducted by questioning the radically dualistic approach of the relationship between thought and reality, which is connected to the constitution of the word as a picture for a subject who represents it. This operation has its condition of possibility, a resemantization of the concept of subject, of the concept of word, and above all, of the concept of thought. Thought, and this applies especially to Hegel, is no longer considered only as the instrument through which the subject can harpoon the word, or as the net that the subject throws on reality by fishing what that net allows him to bring to the surface. Thought is, if anything, what constitutes reality. Something that is, of course, in the subject, in the one who thinks, and yet can never be reduced to the property of a thinking subject. Both the subject and the word can be defined as a being in thought, or even a being of thought. It is precisely this common rooting in something that at once constitutes them and transcends them that allows to think the word and the word to be open to the subject who thinks it. Thought is what in the subject goes beyond the subject itself. So that in thought and with thought, the subject transcends the subjective limits of his experience of reality and can therefore open up to reality. A beyond the subject that is not a substance or a dimension that exists independently of the subject, as it is constituted and manifests itself only through the subject in the relational dynamic that connects the subject to the word and the word to the subject. This beyond, this dimension is made possible by Kant's philosophy, and in particular, according to Hegel and Schelling, by the third critique. But to accomplish it, always according to Hegel and Schelling, it is necessary to go beyond Kant's caution and to overcome the rigid distinction between epistemology and ontology that characterizes his approach. Thanks for your attention and, first of all, for your patience.
Well, Professor Illetterati, we thank you. It was a brilliant and enlightened communication. And usually after the conference, we take a break of 5 minutes,
okay,
only to drink some water, and then we open to the questions. If you agree,
night, and so I can take a beer, perhaps.
Yeah, if you like. It's only 10 to 5 o'clock p.m. so it's not hour to drink yet, but a coffee here would be good. So in more 5 minutes, we come back.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Luca, solo una cosa, ti possono fare le domande anche in tedesco? Se serve, senza problemi, vero? Forse qualcuno si sente più a suo agio col tedesco, immagino.
Ciao. Hi. O professor Vinícius, você pode fazer também a sala para o convidado e a professora Michela.
Eu queria só falar uma coisa, é bem legal porque as atividades do grupo da filosofia clássica alemã, da UFABC, parecem quase que estão num curso paralelo com as atividades do grupo de pesquisa do Luca em Pádua, porque eles também nos últimos meses, né, organizaram uma série de seminários sobre a crítica da faculdade de julgar, se eu lembro bem. Daí era legal ver como as coisas vão se desenvolvendo por caminhos paralelos e no final, né, a gente vai se cruzar.
Sim, e a propósito também, Michela, se você me permite, inclusive, inicialmente eu havia convidado a professora Michela, que é minha colega na Universidade Federal do ABC, para apresentar essa conferência com esse tema. Ela, então, é que disse, olha, mas o professor Illetterati, o professor Luca, que foi orientador da professora Michela, está, neste momento, trabalhando precisamente com esse tema. E talvez fosse interessante para estreitar laços, inclusive convidar o professor Luca. Então, enfim, é isso mesmo, Michela. É muito interessante ver como as agendas confluem, não?
Tem uma grande... Eu vejo que muitos eventos estão sendo organizados sobre esse tema, que estava presente também o Edgar Maraguá, que está organizando um evento bem legal na Espanha sobre a teleologia. Sim, ele estava aqui, não sei se está ainda aqui, mas
No more, he writes me.
Ok, tem alguns dos colegas de Pádua que estão participando nesse evento. Ele está tratando exatamente os mesmos temas do nosso grupo de pesquisa, do grupo de pesquisa de Pádua. Então, são temas que estão sendo debatidos agora. A gente está seguindo essa onda do debate, está bem legal mesmo, ver. E, sobretudo, a possibilidade de se juntar, né?
Uhum.
Mas, além disso, queria também falar uma coisa que eu sempre gosto de falar, de onde eu estou vindo, né? E da tradição, né? Do grupo de pesquisa do Luca. Eu queria lembrar que o nosso grande mestre, o Franco Chiriguin, tem um artigo muito lindo sobre a reflexão hegeliana da teoria da teleologia kantiana. Eu acho que esse foi um ponto de referência para todo mundo que trabalhou esse tema.
Sim. Michela, se você puder depois passar a referência para a gente.
Com certeza. E depois, né, tem esses estudos que o Luca, na verdade, trabalha esse tema faz muito tempo. Tenho aqui. Natura e Ragione. Ele trabalhou esse tema da filosofia da natureza, onde o conceito de teleologia é fundamental, né? Quando ainda a filosofia da natureza não estava no centro do debate nos estudos hegelianos. Vamos dizer que Luca foi um pouco um pioneiro, né? E deu muito certo.
Okay. So, I would like to reopen our activities, and as the organizer, I would like to open the debates with one or two questions to Professor Illetterati. And first of all, I would like to excuse for my bad English, but it's our
nice, that too.
it's our frank language. Now, in Portuguese, we say a língua franca, né? São essas. A língua franca não é a língua francesa.
Italian too, língua franca.
Sim, a língua franca não é o francês, pero é o but. Então, Professor Luca, it was a great pleasure for us to be in touch with your work and to hear your brilliant presentation. It was, for me, especially in particular, it was it make me realize how important is the concept of or the Hegel and Schelling's appropriation of the concept of nature purposiveness and internal purposiveness. How much important is this appropriation and its and Hegel and Schelling's readings of this concept to the to the core of the project of transcend and overcome the oppositions of modern philosophy, such as subject and object, mind and reality, and so on. Then my question. One is related to your strong strong, how we say, this question is related to how how strong was in your interpretation of the post-Kantian tradition as a whole, how strong is the role of the concept of natural purposiveness? You offered us a reading of all the post-Kantian tradition, like idealism, romanticism, Goethe's philosophy of nature, and so on, Schelling's one, and so on, that in which, in your reading, the most important or the key concept is this one of nature or internal purposiveness. But it would mean that all the first part of the third critique is playing no role in this tradition. I mean, I just emphasizing your propositions to open the debates. But how I would like, which is the role played by the problem of reflective judgment not in his objective or teleological use, but only in its subjective or bloß reflektierende. What does I mean? What I mean is that in Fichte's reading and others, I mean, in the idealism tradition readings, the concept of natural teleology is not that important, I would say. So I would just like to hear what would you say about this perception, this the way I understood your propositions. The other question is a more internal to your argument, and it's just provocative. It's just I would say something like that. All the time, Hegel and Schelling, they are telling us that we must transcend the opposition between ontology and epistemology, subject and object, and so on. That the third critique is fundamental. Is just it opened the doors of our minds to the problem of again to the problem of nature, and the most amazing problem of nature, that would be the concept of life. But then to transcend it, they are proposing us a new way of thinking. And my provocative question would be the following. You said that the most important Kantian work to understand all these Hegel's and Schelling's propositions is the third critique and those concepts. But these very structure of an opposition between realism and idealism, between subject and object, and so on, oppositions that must be transcended through a new way of thinking, they bring to my mind much more the dialectic of the first critique than all the problems related to the reflective judgment and so on. So the question is a simple one. Is the third critique that important to the Hegelian project of transcendence, the oppositions of modern philosophy, or the very idea of a new way of thinking that transcend oppositions that we find in the dialectics of the third critique is just enough? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. A lot of things. Thank you very much for the question. I think you're right in a lot of directions. The first thing I want to say is that the second part of the critique of judgment is particularly important, first of all, for Schelling and for his project of a philosophy of nature, in the sense that the proposal of Schelling is to construct a sort of mirror of the transcendental philosophy on the objective part of nature. And so Schelling sees in the third critique the possibility to go into this direction. It is important for Hegel because Hegel wants to overcome the unilateral one-sided perspective of subjectivism and objectivism in a sort of absolute idealism or speculative philosophy. It is important for Goethe in relation to the naturwissenschaftliche Schriften, the texts on natural science of Goethe, and it is important for all the scientists who are working into the project of a philosophy of nature, or in this Schellingian school, so to say. And it is very important because in the last years, it was demonstrated that these scientists that usually positivistic traditions read as not so important in the history of science, were very, very important for the birth of biology. Treviranus was the name who was the one who invented the word biology. He published this book, Biologie oder Philosophie der lebenden Natur für Ärzte, Naturwissenschaftler, and so on. And so it is a very important tradition, that of romantic natural science. So for these people is, so the second part of the critique of the power of judgment is the most important part. But for all the other people is the first part that is the most important, because, and I think for Schelling too, is the first part particularly important, in the sense that the role of art, the role of aesthetics is for Schelling what can overcome transcendental philosophy and natural philosophy. Also, the unity of transcendental philosophy and natural philosophy lies in the aesthetics for Schelling, and so it is obvious. But I think that this is my thesis, that the second part is the part where Hegel is focused, Schelling is focused, because they see in this part the real possibility to find a unity between nature and freedom. You remember that at the very beginning of the critique of the judgment, Kant writes, we have only two kinds of concepts of nature and concept of freedom. And they see in this part the possibility to overcome this separation between nature and freedom. But they see in this part a sort of strong difficulty of Kantian's argument. And it is because of these difficulties that it has sense to work in this direction. Also, the first part gives not so strong difficulties as the second part. The first part, also, Schelling and Hegel says that is okay. There is no problems in the first part, because you are speaking about a subjective teleology and subjective purposiveness. And this is not problematic. This is not so problematic. The problem is when we try to see an objective purposiveness. And you can't, says Hegel, you are seeing the very core of the question. but your instruments are not sufficient in order to go to this question. But the attention to this part for Hegel is the attention around a difficulty, around the problem. The first part is not so problematic as the second part. The second question you put, yeah, you are right. The problems seems they have to do with the first critique and not only with the third critique. But the problem for Hegel is that the first critique gives us the concepts of nature, so to say. Also, they gives the possibility to construct the concepts of nature, the categories that gives us the possibility of knowing nature. And the second critique gives us the possibility of understand the realm of freedom. And this is a sort of fracture. For this reason, in order to thematize this fracture, we need the third critique. The third critique is the locus, is the place where all the problems of the critical philosophy of the transcendentalism has a sort of explicitation, a sort of realization of the problematic of the critical philosophy. In my view, I have this idea that really for Hegel, for Schelling, for these people, what is interesting of the third critique is that he is really problematic. And this is the interesting point. Also, in the first critique and in the second critique, it is coherent, but in the third critique, this coherence is not so fluid, it's not so consistent, and these make the third critique the most important. Because of this problematicity, may I say problematicity? I don't know, but because it is problematic. This is the real point of the focusing on the third critique. I think I've not answered to your question, but it was only a reflection.
No, surely you did, and it's very interesting in your answer, because it make us see how much those philosophers, they were engaged in what they saw as the progress of Wissenschaften. I mean, they were not reading texts of the history of philosophy. They were dealing with what were the real scientific problems of the days, because you showed us that the second part of the third critique is the most important, because this is where the most difficult lies. And if the difficulty of Kantian thought lies there, it's because it's there where we have to work to make it progress. Yeah. So it's very interesting, because in
order to talk, it is interesting that the last two volumes of the critical edition of Hegel's works is the recollection of the Hegel's bibliothek, Hegel's library. as the books and the magazines Hegel's had at home in his office. And it is interesting to see that Hegel's was interested in 3-4 fields of his contemporary sciences, and these are mathematics, biology, as natural science in general, geology. He has a lot of things about geology, and a little bit on political writings and political sciences, but not so much as mathematics, botanics, and geology. And this is very interesting that he was up to date to the debate in natural science, and I think he had a more deep knowledge of natural science as in other fields where he is famous, for example, aesthetics. Yeah, he was a reader of the new poetry, but he has the same deepness of knowledge as in natural sciences. It was only two.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you very much, Professor Illetterati. So we have inscriptions to questions, and we go on the debate. So the first one is Professor Vinicius. So Vinicius, please.
So thank you, Luca. It was a great conference. I'd like to ask you, can I do that in Italianisch?
Per favore, per favore.
Lei comprende bene l'italiano?
Abbastanza, mi va anche abbastanza bene.
Allora Luca, ti ringrazio tantissimo, è stata una bellissima conferenza e quello, insomma, ti faccio una questione da un punto di vista un po' kantiano. Non
mi stupisce.
Non è un combatto, ma volevo capire una cosa, perché mi hai fatto capire tantissime cose, questa transizione da Kant a Hegel e pure a Schelling, e questo è molto interessante. Ma quello che ti volevo domandare allora, perché hai detto che insomma la terza critica demarca una problematica, c'è una problematicità, cioè, e tanto Hegel quanto Schelling credo hanno donato delle risposte a questi problemi. E quello che mi è difficile da capire da un punto di vista kantiano è quello: sì, la finalità organica è una finalità esterna al soggetto, cioè se la finalità interna all'organismo è propriamente esterna al soggetto, non è puramente soggettiva, come faccio a capirla? Questo proprio è una domanda di un kantiano per un hegeliano. Come faccio a capire la finalità dell'organismo una volta che adesso comprendo che non è una finalità soggettiva, ma è proprio esterna al soggetto? E ho capito bene come Hegel pone la questione, questo è proprio bello, ma qual è la risposta? Cioè, perché questo non mi obbliga a fare del pensiero del soggetto qualcosa di, insomma, subordinata a un intelletto più globale, chi capisce il soggetto e l'oggetto. È quello che non so se mi sono fatto chiaro. Cioè, come faccio a capire questa finalità organica che adesso è proprio interna, cioè esterna al soggetto? È quello che volevo ascoltarti un po'. Ma ti ringrazio tantissimo, è stato bellissimo.
Grazie davvero a te. non so, may I talk in Italian or in English or?
As you prefer.
I prefer in Italian, but I
Bruno,
try to...
Luca, desculpa interromper. Será que não é um caso de traduzir a pergunta em português para
in italiano, non è?
No,
Bom,
chiedendo...
não sei.
Não sei se estava claro.
Tá. Eu entendi. O pessoal quer que explique.
Eu posso resumir muito rapidamente.
Não, acho que deu para entender. Como
compreender,
né? Como capire, né? Deu para entender.
Come capire.
I try to answer in English. No, the question is very, very interesting, Vinicius. It is always beautiful for me to say Vinicius. I have always the impression to speak with Vinicius de Moraes, and it is exciting for me. How can I understand these purposiveness, you say, that is external to the subject? But the answer is that it is not external to the subject. The subject is thought, and thought is the possibility of giving sense of this purposiveness. The problem is that what Hegel wants to overcome is the idea that there is something inner and something outer. And when we think of ourselves, we are thinking not only of ourselves, we are thinking of reality, thinking ourselves. And so reality is not something for Hegel that is outer from subject. And so I understand this kind of purposiveness. I want to give you a very trivial answer, because I live it. And because I live it, I can thought of it, I can think of it. The problem is to think that if it is objective, it is something that is outer, that is beyond the subject. And this is the problem for Hegel, that what is objective is not outer. And what is subjective is not the other side, also the opposite of the objectivity. At the end of my talk, I tried to say that thought, and this is what I think of Hegel, that thought is the possibility that subjects have in order to transcend themselves. Also, thought is the possibility that is in the subjectivity, that is into the subjectivity, through which subjectivity goes beyond itself. It can overcome the limits of its subjectivity. And this possibility of overcoming the subjectivist position is in thought and not outer of thought. Is not in something that is in another dimension. is thought that is the possibility of overcoming a mere subjectivist point of view. And in this sense, I wanted to answer to the question that Ricardo wrote in the chat. And yeah, my position is I'm not an idealist. I'm not an idealist, and I think that to be an idealist is only to be a counterpart of the realist. And we have to precise. For Hegel, every philosopher is an idealist in the sense that he understands that the origin is in thought. And this is okay for me too. But I'm not an idealist in the sense that that the origin of our comprehension of the world is only in a sort of subjective is in a sort of negation of the independence of the world. I think that the world is mind independent, but it's not thought independent. It's mind independent in the sense that the world is not what I want that the world is. But I'm not the lord of the thought. Thought is something that is more than me, something that I can't control. I always say to my students that when Kant says that we have to be the owner of our thought, that we have to think from ourselves, Kant is asking us to submit our subjective intention to the authority of thought, to think autonomously doesn't mean to think as I want. It means to think as thought wants, as the logic of thought wants, as the coherence of rationality wants. And so it's nothing subjectivist. Is a sort of recognition that there is something more that my subjectivist view. And this something more is not something that is in a beyond, in another dimension, but this something more is thought, is the die Macht des Denkens. I don't know in English as to say, the power of thought, no, in this sense. The power of thought is something more than what subjects want with thinking. Yeah, I'm sorry for my English, but...
No, it was a beautiful answer to another provocative question of Professor Tassinari.
Yeah, so, Ricardo, I think you are right.
So we can go on. And the next inscription is from our Professor Maria Lúcia Cacciola from Universidade de São Paulo. Please, Professor Maria Lúcia. Áudio, Maria Lúcia. We are not hearing you.
Well, I'll try to speak English, ma io mi ringrazio moltissimo della bellissima conferenza e voglio anche fare una piccola questione e andare un po' indietro, zurück zu Kant. Well, I would like to ask you in the beginning of your conference, you've spoken about the difference between, well, the separation between the ontology and epistemology. Well, and now I remember a quotation of our professor here in Brazil, Gérard Lebrun. He was 20 or more years here. And he begins his book about the third critic.
I have done too.
Kant, La Fin de la Métaphysique. He says in introduction that Kant had transformed the ontological question in an epistemological question. And I would like to know, I would like also to ask you if the post-Kantians, and I study also Schopenhauer and was reading today by chance in a project, people's project, the letters of dogmatism and criticism. And the preoccupation of all these post-Kantians is to unify, as you told us, Hegel also, unifying ontology and epistemology. So the idea that we're talking about reality and not only about thinking. And I agree, that's the problem also with Schopenhauer and his will to live, and also with Hegel, that the thought says the reality, we're talking about the reality, and also with Schelling and his aim to unify this spheres and realism and idealism, as the very case. But
is okay for me.
But I would like to ask you if I have the idea that for Kant, even in the third critique, it wasn't a question of the essence and to think and to be. It was the question that we think about the word. We think about, we know and think about the word, the nature, and the organic beings, and so on. But it's a thinking about. We can't go through the essence, through the interior of things. And we have no aim in doing that. It's not our purpose. I think that's, we have to explain what art is, what the feeling of the beautiful is, but not in the essence of art. We are going to explain as the genius creates art, as he cannot be taught, and so on. But it's not the essence of the things that Kant is searching. So I think that the post-Kantians, the idealists, named idealists, They went beyond Kant, really. But in a certain way, they came, they don't make, well, they go a little bit behind, because I think they propose that we can think, we need to think about the essence of things, and to understand also this way. And for the criticism, the critical project, as Kant says, we have to have, and I quote another professor, Rubens Torres Filho, a Brazilian professor, that had said, the dualism is the very soul of the critical project. So yes, I think that if you don't put a thing in itself as unknown, we don't have to know, and Kant has no interest in knowing the thing itself. If you don't know, if you don't put a dualism between phenomenon and nomenon, we don't have a possibility to create a critical project in the sense of Kant. And that's my question. Well, it's fantastical, the project of the idealists and post-Kantians, but it's another project. They inspirate themselves, certainly, as you said, in the third critique. But I think that they also hanno tradito, come si dice in inglese, hanno tradito Kant.
Mm-hmm.
Come si dice traíram in inglese? Non sei.
Acho que é betrayed.
Huh? They betrayed Kant.
Betrayed.
In a good sense. It's another interpretation of the real, but it's not the same. And so criticize Kant, good. They go beyond Kant, good. But it's not the same thing anymore. Thank you very much. And if you can say something about it, I will be very happy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think you are right. The project of the post-Kantian is another project. Is no more the critical project. And you are right when you say that, for example, the problem of Kant in the first part of the Critique of Judgment is not to say what art is. It's not an ontological problem, that of Kant, but what is our judgment about art, about artistic activities, and not what is. This is a typical question of the analytic philosophy today, no? That what are the properties that make a work of art? What are the properties that can with which we can distinguish an artifact that is not a work of art and an artifact that is a work of art? Also, these kind of questions is not a problem for Kant. Perhaps it's a problem for Hegel. In his aesthetics, there is a question about the real being of art. But and you are right when you say that for Kant the problem is not to know the thing in itself, but the problem is that Kant says that the thing in itself is something, and when he says that is something, he's he's producing a judgment that Jacobi told is a judgment of existence. He is applying the category of existence to something where he can't apply the category of existence because for the thing of itself. And so these are, you are completely right that these are two different programs, but behind these differences of program, there is a question that is what you quoted about the book of, how was the first you quoted? Lebrun. That in Kant there is a sort of absorption of ontology into epistemology, a sort of reduction of the ontological problematic into an epistemological problematic. And the possible consequence of this absorption, of this reducing ontology into epistemology, is to think that what we are saying about the world is only something that is rooted in the subjective perspective. This is the risk that the idealists, so to say, that the post-Kantian see in the Kantian perspective. I try to say it rough. What they see as a risk is a sort of negation of reality, a sort of annihilation of reality, a nihilism of the world, that the world is only in our thought, in our words, and not, and the word, what the world is outer our thinking is nothing. And these, I think, is the problem they see. The risk of that the subjects are talking about themselves when they are talking about reality. So that every talk, every discourse about reality is only a discourse on the subject's into itself. And this is the risk they see, I think. And so you are right, these are two different positions, but there are metaphysical consequences in the position of Kant. And the metaphysical consequences has to do with the risk of a negation of the force of reality, of the John McDowell speaks about, Michela, how is in English, attrito, what makes that we have, we see a sort of resistance in the reality. And if ontology is dissolved into epistemology, there is no more resistance in the reality. There is no more this friction. The term was friction. There is no more friction between my talk about reality and reality. And I think this is the problem for the post-Kantian thinkers. Constraint, thank you.
I thank you too. And I want to say also that I think about Jacobi, because this censure he makes that we can go to solipsism.
Yeah.
He makes this this provocation, to say so, and said, no, solipsism is the danger, nihilism is the danger, and I'm a realist, I'm against philosophy, and so on. And so it was about the thing in itself, all about the thing in itself, that Jacobi explicates, explains very well the problem of the category of reality and causation that's put in the thing itself. Well, that's okay. But I think that the problem is the thing itself is real, but we cannot be interested in it. Oh, I thank you very much. It was very...
Oh, thank you, thank you.
And I thank you, Professor. Oh, grazie Michele anche per proporzionare questo. Ciao.
Bom, então agora dando prosseguimento ao debate. Agora então é Pedro Farha, por favor, né, com a palavra, né, o meu orientando, aluno e, sobretudo, co-organizador, Pedro Farha, sem a ajuda do qual, certamente, nada disso estaria acontecendo. Então, por favor, com a palavra, o Pedro.
Thank you, Bruno. Obrigado, Bruno. Just to, Michela suggested to close the inscriptions for questions, so we'll just do these three, okay? And then we'll end the conference. And I wrote the question here, so I will read for you, Professor Luca, okay? Thank you for your conference. Your talk was very interesting. I will ask my question in English and then translate it to Portuguese. It's very short. I understand that Kant's teleological judgment as free from ontological implications like the ones we see when the determinate judgment is acting, like when we investigate nature under necessary laws. But what could be the status of reflective and teleological judgment? It only a matter of our transcendental and necessary subjectivity, or is it possible to think of the reflective judgment as a methodological guideline or tool for philosophy? I think this question could be a question that is implied in Hegel's reading of Kant's teleological judgment, but I would like to listen to you for some enlightenment on that question. Thank you. Now I will ask in Portuguese. Eu perguntei ao professor Illetterati se a faculdade de julgar teleológica, apesar da leitura que a transforma ou a vê como uma mera questão subjetiva, poderia ter algum valor metodológico para a filosofia. Pois me parece que isso poderia estar envolvido, especialmente na leitura do Hegel. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not sure I'm capable to answer to this question. First, a clarification. Yeah, I told that teleological judgment is free from an ontological implication in Kant. But this is not so right, I think, in the sense that, yeah, it seems that for Kant, teleological judgment has only an epistemological value, but when he says that an organism is not a machine, he is giving to the internal purposiveness an ontological value. And in the sense that if we want to be coherent with Kant, we cannot say that the organism is not a machine. I can only say that an organism is not has not the same knowing possibilities as a machine or as an organism. I wanted to say that to say the organism is not a machine is an ontological statement. And I think that this ontological statement is not coherent with Kant assumptions. For Hegel and Schelling, this ontological statement is fundamental, and they wanted to ground the possibility to say that an organism is not a machine, and that a machine is something different than an organism. But for Kant, it's not so coherent to say that an organism is not a machine, in my opinion. So, but your question is very interesting, because you say that what Kant is developing in his idea of a reflective judgment could be thought as a sort of methodology for philosophy in general. And I think you are right. And I think that Hegel is thinking a sort of way of proceeding of philosophy that is near to the idea of a reflective judgment. That philosophy has to find a universality that is not given, that is never given. This is the real question for Hegel, and is the question that Hegel developed moving from Kant. The idea that universality is not something that we have mere singularity and that is already given. But universality is a process that comes from the reflection in the singularity and particularity. And so I remember what told me when I was a student, an Italian scholar of Hegel. He was Valerio Verra, and Verra told me that if you want to understand what Hegel says in the theory of the syllogism and in absolute method, you have to go to the reflective judgment, to this activity of reflection where the universality is never something given, but it is something that you have to find. You have to produce the universality, working on the individuality, on the singularity, on the particularity. And I think that this point you have highlighted is a very important point in order to understand the process of philosophy and what differences the work of philosophy from the works of particular sciences, where it's not the case that in particular sciences we have a sort of proceeding that is similar to the determining judgment. We have universality, and we have to capture the individuality through the universality. But this is not the case of philosophy. In the case of philosophy, we have to find the universality through the works in the individual, on the individuality. And I think that the role of natural sciences is for Hegel a sort of passage from the manifold to a real, a concrete universality. Also, natural sciences prepare, so to say, the materials in order to work, in order to find a concrete universality. I don't know if I answered to your question, but it is really important what you say. Really.
Yeah. Go on. We have two last questions.
I've seen that there is a question of Sandra.
One for...
Hi, Sandra.
Palermo e Letícia Helena, ainda antes da pergunta de Sandra. A pergunta de Letícia comes from YouTube. So, because of that, Pedro Farha will read the question to you, Illetterati. Okay?
Okay.
So, Pedro, could you read the question from Letícia, please?
Yes. Okay. Letícia Helena from YouTube, she says, first, thank you, Luca, for your presentation. My name is Letícia, and I would like you to comment on how Schelling links the Kantian notion of organism as endowed with self-causality with the idea of nature as art, Natur als Kunst. To think the organism in favor of the unity between nature and spirit from the subject himself and not of something external to him. How would Kant react to such a proposal? That's her question.
Yeah, you have to ask to the circle of the Kantians and not me. This is a question for Professor Nadai, for Vinicius, for all the people, how Kant reacts to it. I think that there is one thing that we can say. It is interesting to see where the works of Kant were going in the so-called opus posthumum. In the so-called opus posthumum, there is a sort, as Maria Lucia told, of new ontology in a certain sense. Also, Kant is going through a possibility of a new ontology. I have this picture, but it's only a subjective picture, so to say, that Kant was worried in the center of his career to the criticism of the dogmatism and the old metaphysics, and besides this kind to do philosophy. But when he has deconstructed this building of the old metaphysics, now at the end of his life is ready in order to rethink a new metaphysics and a new ontology. A new metaphysics in the sense that it is not a reproposal of the old metaphysics, but of a new metaphysics that is coherent with critical philosophy. I think that Kant has never abandoned the project of a metaphysics. Never, never, never. And in the last writings, this appears clearly, that there is now the possibility to elaborate a new metaphysical thought that has no more the limits of the old metaphysical thought of the dogmatic metaphysics. And in this sense, I think that Kant is thinking that these new people are completely crazy, but they have a sort of good intention at the origin, that is to rebuild a new possibility for the metaphysics, a new possibility for the ontology. But they are crazy, sorry, they are completely crazy. Sandra asks me if the notion of life is a sort of model for this new concept of thought. And if it is the case, what does it mean? Yeah, it is clear that for Hegel, life is the model for a framework of rationality. If as a rationality is something that is never already given, and that like life is something that is only if it is active, if it is living, so to say. There is this passage in Aristotle that for Hegel was fundamental. Aristotle says the essence of the living beings is to live. The essence of the living being is to live in the sense that there is no essence in a certain sense. There is no something substantial that is what makes a living being a living being. Living being is to live, is to live. And rationality is to think. There is no rationality in the sense that we have rationality in a table, we have rationality, we can see rationality like a sort of picture. Rationality is thinking, is the activity of thinking, is the continuously criticism that thinking is in itself. And this is what Hegel takes from Kant, that there is no thought in the sense that is something that is already there. Thought is the activity of thinking. Thought, says Hegel, but he is repeating Kant. Thought is the I, and not the I in the sense that it is something subjective. The I in the sense that it is the activity of thinking. There is another Aristotelian quotation that it is, yeah, perfect, the anima of Aristotle. There is another Aristotelian quotation that is for Hegel fundamental. And all of Aristotle is for Hegel fundamental, obviously, but there is this quotation that Hegel says, life is praxis and not poiesis. And what does it mean that life is praxis and not poiesis? That life is not a production, something that is really where process of production is ended. Like it is in all the poetical production. Aristotle says, if I'm constructing a bed, the bed is, when the bed is finished, we have the bed. Life is praxis, is not poiesis. There is not a production that gives origin to something. The something is the production itself, is the action itself. There is nothing when action ends. There is nothing. Life is in action, is the action. And so rationality is the same. Rationality is nothing outer thinking activity. Rationality is thinking activity. If the essence of living beings is to live, the essence of rationality is to think. There is no rationality beyond thinking. There is no life beyond living.
Well,
sorry.
Another very beautiful answer. We came to the end of our conference, and being so, I can just once more thanks very much to Professor Luca Illetterati. I'm completely sure that I talk in name of all of us, professors and students, that it was a great pleasure, and that we
I think that Bruno has disconnected, unfortunately. But I'm waiting for him to show here for me so I can approve his entry. But I think he was saying to you, Professor, that it was a very good conference. And
oh, he's here.
Yeah,
Professor Nagai.
Oh, he's back. Okay.
No, I was just thanking once more to Professor Luca Illetterati. It was a great pleasure, and we all learned a lot with this brilliant presentation. And I hope that we can be in touch, and that we could make more effective and closer academical relationships. And Professor Michela is here also to make it possible, and I thank her also, and also all other participants, the professors that are also involved in our conferences, and all the students here, and this is it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Professor Luca, if you would say something.
I wanted always to say that it is, it's not rhetoric for me, but I find, I feel myself as a real friend of the Brazilian community, the Brazilian philosophical community. As Michela was the best of my students, and I'm happy that Brazil has Michela as a professor. But really, every time I had a connection with the Brazilian community, with the Brazilian Hegelian society, and with other people in Brazil, with Vinicius, with a lot of friends, I felt myself always at home. And it is really important for me as a research and teaching is not only a competitive action, but it is a place of friends where we can meet us with friends. And so thank you very much for your invitation and for your friendship and kindness, really.
Yeah. Thank you once more for those beautiful words. I would say that those feelings are reciprocal, and we thank you once more.
Thank you.
So, para todos, então, agradeço a presença e dou por encerrado os trabalhos de hoje. Lembrando, então, que na quinta-feira que vem, agora no horário e dias de hábito, a gente tem a conferência de encerramento com o professor Vinícius, professora Maria Lúcia e o professor Ricardo Terra. Eu estou também agora, Vinícius, escrevendo para você, que estou devendo desde a outra 15 dias, sobre o modelo do encerramento, mas não esqueci não, a gente fecha sobre isso de organização. Então, se alguém quiser falar alguma coisa, senão eu dou por encerrado. Alguém quer tomar a palavra?
Eu quero.
Ah, professora.
Não, eu quero só agradecer mais uma vez ao Bruno e ao Pedro, né, e à Michela, a brilhante feito de trazer aqui o professor que nos deu uma conferência tão legal. Tá? Obrigada.
Tá, então é isso. Boa tarde.
Também. A Michela queria falar, eu que interrompi.
Michela, por favor.
No, parlerò in italiano, lentamente. Vorrei ringraziare davvero Luca per aver accettato l'invito di Pedro e Bruno. Credo veramente che sia importante costruire ponti e collaborazioni di ricerca tra il nostro programma e anche con la società di Hegel e altre società hegeliane e tutto quello che succede con il gruppo di Padova. E sono veramente tanto contenta, davvero. Grazie, Luca.
Grazie.
Então é isso, gente. Obrigado, Michela. E boa tarde, boa noite a todos. Mais uma vez, obrigado, Luca. E é isso.